Today, we're starting with a trivia question that might stump even the most dedicated car enthusiasts. Let's see how you do. For nearly the first 25 years of its production, the classic Volkswagen Beetle sold in America had no fuel gauge. So how did drivers know when they were about to run out of gas? Was it A, a special warning light that would flash when the tank was low? B, a dipstick in the gas tank, like checking your oil? C, a manually operated reserve fuel tank? D, they just had to guess and hope for the best? If you answered C, a manually operated reserve fuel tank, you are absolutely correct. When the car started to sputter, the driver would simply reach down and flip a lever on the floor. This would open up a reserve supply of about 1 gallon of gas, giving them plenty of time to find a gas station. This wasn't a flaw or an oversight, it was a feature, and it perfectly explains the entire philosophy behind one of the most beloved cars ever made. Today we're exploring why the missing fuel gauge was a stroke of genius, the philosophy of simplicity. To understand the reserve tank, you have to understand the Beetle itself. The car was born from a simple mission, to be a people's car. It needed to be affordable to buy, cheap to run, and simple enough for an owner to maintain with basic tools. In this pursuit of ultimate simplicity, things we consider standard today were seen as unnecessary luxuries. The early Beetle had no radiator because its engine was air-cooled. It had no complex electronics, and for many years, it had no fuel gauge. Why? Because a fuel gauge with its float sender unit and wiring was another part that could break and cost money to fix. Volkswagen's engineers chose a mechanical solution that was virtually foolproof. Instead of adding a component that could fail, they designed a system that relied on the driver's direct involvement. This wasn't just about saving money, it was about building a car that was fundamentally more reliable. How it worked, a mechanical masterpiece. So how did this system actually work? It was elegant in its simplicity. Inside the fuel tank, there wasn't a separate reserve compartment. There was just one tank. The magic happened at the fuel tap, which was the outlet at the bottom of the tank. This tap had two small pipes extending up into the tank at different heights. The taller pipe was for the main fuel supply. When you were driving normally, the fuel would be drawn from this upper pipe. As long as the gas level was above the top of this pipe, everything was fine. But as soon as the fuel level dropped below it, the engine would start to sputter and lose power. This sputter was your low fuel warning light. This is where the driver came in. When the car started to sputter, you knew you had used up your main supply. You would then reach down to a small lever, usually located on the firewall by your feet, and flip it to the reserve position, giving you access to the rest of the fuel, your reserve supply. This was typically about 1 gallon, more than enough to get you 25 to 30 miles to the nearest gas station. There was one crucial catch, however. After you refuel, you had to remember to flip the lever back to the main on position. If you forgot and left it on reserve, you would use up your entire tank, including the reserve portion. The next time the engine sputtered, you wouldn't be reaching for a lever. You'd be walking, the human element living without a gauge. Driving a car without a fuel gauge might seem stressful today, but for millions of Beetle owners, it was just a normal part of the experience. It created a more direct mechanical connection between the driver and the car. You didn't rely on a needle. You relied on your senses and your memory. This system forced drivers to be more aware. You learned your car's range. You paid attention to how far you'd driven since your last fill-up. The sputter of the engine wasn't a moment of panic. It was a calm, predictable signal to perform a simple action. The Beetle's reserve tank was a simple mechanical valve. It was a system built on trust of the driver's own awareness. The evolution, the arrival of the gauge. The reserve fuel tap was a signature feature on Beetles sold in the U.S. from the early 1950s until 1961. But as the years went on and customer expectations changed, Volkswagen began to phase it out. As early as 1955, a VDO electric fuel gauge was offered as an optional accessory that could be installed on the dashboard. However, it wasn't until the 1962 model year that a fuel gauge became standard equipment from the factory. These first standard gauges were mechanical. It was still a very simple system compared to modern electronics. By 1968, the design evolved again, and the fuel gauge was finally integrated directly into the speedometer, where it would remain for the rest of the classic Beetles production. The era of the reserve tap was over, but its legacy was cemented. Conclusion, and a symbol of an era. The Beetles' missing fuel gauge is more than just a piece of automotive trivia. It's a perfect symbol of the car's entire design philosophy. In an age when American cars were getting bigger, more complicated, and loaded with gadgets, the Beetle was a statement of rebellion. It was a car that celebrated simplicity, reliability, and clever, cost-effective engineering. The reserve fuel tank was the embodiment of that spirit. It was an honest mechanical solution to a simple problem. It didn't just tell you when you were low on fuel, it gave you a guaranteed way to get to safety, and it asked for nothing more than a little participation from the driver. The story of the Beetle's missing fuel gauge is a charming reminder of a time when simplicity was the ultimate feature and when no gauge meant no problem.